All right, guys. Well, we are right at 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everybody. It's so great to see you guys. As Stacy said, I'm Angie Vera, the events manager for Optiport and Perk. We're excited to welcome you to our November lunchtime learning series. Today we have Ellen Katz from Markelin joining us to discuss feedback that fuels growth. So huge shout out to Markelin. Thank you for being an amazing partner and sponsor. We appreciate all your support. If you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. So applications are open for our Golden Opportunity Award. This program provides up to three $50,000 grants to help new ODs launch or grow an independent practice. It's created to remove one of the biggest barriers, capital, and give deserving doctors the support, visibility, and resources they need to take the next step in ownership. So if you know a colleague or an associate or a friend who's building towards ownership or dreaming about it, please share this with them. They do not have to be a PERK or Optiport member to apply. So if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, we do have enrollment for our 2026 Management Development Program open. I'm going to pass things on to Stacy to share more.
I'll just quickly say that the management development program, especially these exclusive classes for Perk and OptiPort, have been amazing. A lot of our champions have gone through this. As long as we keep enrolling Perk and OptiPort members, we'll continue to have an exclusive course. It is a 6-month course to build managers, whether you're a new manager, you have a manager you're wanting to grow, or you've been in your position for a long time. I'd love to talk to you more about the management development program. You can click there to access more details, or you can email me or call me and I'm happy to talk about those. Okay.
Can go ahead and go to the next slide.
All right, so we are also offer the Eye Care Practice Accelerator System with NSG. This is something that doctors and staff members work together to do these courses. It's a year long, and you really focus on the top things that you need to grow in your practice. You have the opportunity to scan here and schedule a session with NSG to learn more about Accelerator.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stacy.
Yeah.
And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, guys. So, sorry, taking my notes here. So we do FYI, just a couple of housekeeping items. Everyone is muted on the call for this next session. So please utilize the chat box for any comments or questions. Like I said, we're excited to have Ellen Katz, the training manager for Markelin Eye Care, on the line with us. Markelin's a manufacturer of multiple premium eyewear brands. Ellen has spent her entire professional life in the eyewear industry, with 14 years with Silhouette Optical and joining Markelin in April of 2018. So for the past decade, her focus has been on training and development, working to create internal teams and eye care professionals that are equipped with skills and knowledge they need to succeed in a rapidly changing world. Ellen's joining us today to share with us how we can deliver feedback that's specific, timely, and focused on growth, receive feedback with openness, self-awareness, and turning it into opportunity, and using feedback as a tool to strengthen collaboration and drive results. So happy to pass things along to Ellen.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you guys for having me back as well. It's lovely to be here again today. So yeah, the topic that we have for our session today, it's kind of a continuation. Anyone that was on the last session that I did was focused on onboarding new employees, kind of taking them from new hire to full capacity employee. And so this kind of picks up where that one left off, right? Once someone is a full-fledged employee, they're up to where you want them to be, their growth doesn't stop, or it shouldn't stop, right? We still need to continue to growing them professionally. And one of the best ways that we can do that is through feedback. So the couple session goals, just to reiterate, this is really what I hope you guys leave the next 45-ish minutes, hour with, is understanding, yeah, how do you deliver feedback that's good, right? Not all feedback is created equal. Just giving someone feedback doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually going to fuel growth. Sometimes it can have the opposite effect, which is not what we want. So we're going to talk about how do you deliver good feedback, quality feedback that's going to help grow. Again, whether you're talking peer-to-peer, manager to employee, employee to manager, or even in your personal life. I use actually a lot of these techniques with my kids and my husband, maybe to their dismay, but it really applies across the board, not just professionally. How to receive feedback can actually be harder sometimes than giving feedback. Is how do you get feedback, especially when it's maybe not the most positive, and how do you kind of take that and use it to grow yourself professionally? And then also, how do you create a culture of feedback, right? One where people feel empowered, they feel safe to give feedback that is real and that is high quality. So that's what my goal is for all of you, that you know a little bit more about each of these things by the end of our time together today. Let's start with what is the impact of feedback, right? Both when it's not there and then when it is high quality and we're seeing a lot of it. So let's start kind of with the bad here, right? So when feedback lacks, what happens from an organizational perspective? Well, 43% of people report that when they are not getting regular feedback, they are more likely to leave their role within 2 years. So that means, right, we talked a lot on the last session about how expensive it is to hire a new person, how much stress it puts on everyone else that's kind of left behind when somebody leaves. So when you have high quality employees, you want to retain them. And not providing regular feedback actually runs the risk of them being much more likely to leave to find a new opportunity elsewhere. Are people getting good feedback on a regular basis? Well, this next stat kind of says no, right? 74% of people said that they feel in the dark about their work performance. That's really not a sentence that you ever want people to use when you ask them how they feel, right, about their performance at work. We don't want to feel in the dark. We don't want to feel like we have no idea how we're doing, right? I think I'm doing okay. I don't know. It's not great. So people who aren't getting regular feedback feel kind of a little bit lost. And then we ask people, well, are you getting regular feedback? And really, at least half of people, 50%, say no, they're only receiving feedback from their manager a few times a year or less. So again, we're not only talking about manager to employee feedback here, but that is a big one. And we're seeing across the board that it's really something that's not being done that frequently. So let's kind of look at the flip side of this. What happens when we do see regular feedback being given in an organization? We see people who are a lot more motivated to do outstanding work. So this is weekly versus annual feedback, people who are giving feedback on a weekly basis versus one time a year. 3.2 times more likely to do outstanding work for the organization, or excuse me, to feel motivated to do outstanding work, which is definitely more than half the battle. We see 68% of people who have received regular feedback, that is high quality feedback, feeling more satisfied that their job's aligned with the organizational goals. So that's a big one. We talk about feedback is, do I feel part of kind of the larger picture? And it really can make a difference there. And then 80% of people who received meaningful feedback, and this is in the past week, that's what the stat's talking about, are fully engaged. So when we see feedback lacking, we see people who are likelier to leave, they're not very motivated, they feel kind of in the dark. On the flip side, when people are receiving regular high quality feedback, they're much more motivated, they're fully engaged, and they really feel part of that team. So it's absolutely very important that we're providing regular feedback that is of high quality, right, on a consistent basis. Now, all of that said, it's obviously not that easy, because if providing high quality feedback was very easy, I probably wouldn't be here today talking about it, right? So what are some of the issues, some of the barriers that we see commonly happening around, right, why high quality feedback isn't being given on a regular basis? Well, they might be emotional barriers, right? So this can be true, certainly if we're talking about kind of manager to employee feedback, but even more so, I would say, if we're talking kind of that peer-to-peer level or feedback up from, employee to manager, you might fear causing tension, causing conflict, right? Or damaging rapport or trust with someone. And so you might, have something to say, something you think could be better, but maybe you keep that to yourself because you just don't want to kind of rock the boat. That's very, very common. Or you have a concern about being overly critical, about being perceived as being overly critical, right? So those are some common emotional barriers to providing feedback. Practical. We are all very, very busy. I'm sure that all of you feel this too, right? Where the tasks that you have to do in the day are just not equaling the amount of hours that you have to do them, right? So you might just be feeling too busy to prioritize feedback. Maybe you see something that you feel like you need to provide feedback on, but you just don't get around to it. Or you kind of say, well, we'll talk about that later, right? We have a meeting next week, next month. We have an annual review. I'll bring it up then. That's something that we see as a practical barrier. Another thing that can be a practical barrier is our own assumptions, right? I won't repeat the adage about assuming, because I think we probably all know it, but we might think, of course they know that that's not the best way to do that, right? Or I'm assuming they know they didn't do that great of a job and they're going to do better next time. But as that phrase says, right, it's dangerous to make assumptions. If someone is performing in a way that we don't think is kind of optimal, it's likely that they don't actually recognize that. So we don't want to assume that they know or that they understand that there's maybe an issue. And then we have structural barriers. This is really more about organization overall, but it's a really common thing that there's no kind of norms set around feedback, right? There's no clear model for providing it. There's no method that's kind of agreed upon, especially when we're talking about peer-to-peer feedback or employee to manager feedback, right? If there isn't some kind of structure around that, it can feel like I don't want to overstep. Isn't my place to say anything? So not providing kind of from a corporate level or from a practice level, a structure for feedback and some norms around it, or not talking about feedback as an important thing, that can absolutely be a barrier as well. So these are all some kind of barriers. As we go through the rest of the presentation, we're going to talk about, okay, how can we overcome these? How can we kind of get past these barriers so that we are creating a really great feedback culture where everyone feels empowered to give and also to receive high quality feedback from each other. So what's the goal of feedback, right? You know, it's important. We talked about why it doesn't always happen. But what is actually the goal of feedback? The goal of feedback is not just to give feedback, right? If that was the goal, it'd be incredibly easy to give good feedback, right? Good job. Bad job. I hated that. I loved it, right? Feed done. We're good. But that's not actually, of course, the goal. The goal of feedback is to get the person you're giving the feedback to think differently about their performance and to ultimately change their behavior in the future. Or if we're talking about positive feedback, to continue that behavior in the future, right? To reinforce it. When I tell my kids, you know, positive feedback about something, I don't just say, good job. I say, hey, I really liked when you came right in and you started doing your homework because I had a lot going on and I couldn't, tackle that right then. That was really helpful for me. So it's specific, right? Because I want them to continue to do that in the future. So I said in the beginning, not all feedback's created equal. There's a lot of feedback, and actually the research shows that the bulk of the feedback in organizations is not high quality, and it does not accomplish this goal, this stated goal, right? In fact, a lot of feedback actually can have the opposite effect, and it can put two people who are trying to kind of get closer together in terms of how do we move forward, actually it can leave them farther apart. And so there's a real danger not only to not giving feedback, but also to kind of not paying attention to how you give feedback or not doing trainings like this, which talk about, right, what makes quality feedback, that you might end up actually kind of doing the opposite of what you intend to do. So we're going to talk about that and how to avoid that when you are actually giving feedback out there, either in the workplace or personal life, whatever. Let's talk about how do we give feedback effectively, right? What do we have to think about when we are providing feedback to make that effective? One thing I want to kind of talk about or make you aware of, I guess, before we dive into the tactical hows, is what's actually happening in the brain of the person that you are giving feedback to versus what's happening in your brain when you're the one providing feedback. I always think it's really important to kind of understand some of these underlying issues or things to just be aware of, because it actually impacts kind of where you're coming from and how they perceive what you're saying. So what do I mean? Well, research has found that there tends to be large differences in what we attribute the success or the failure to in the mind of the person giving the feedback versus the person receiving the feedback. So, what does that actually mean? Well, that means that when we receive positive feedback, we tend to attribute it to our own efforts and abilities, right? So someone says to me, "Hey, Ellen, good job on that presentation the other day." I think, yeah, I am good at my job, right? I am a good speaker and I did the work and I'm attributing it to myself. Now, if someone says, "Hey, Ellen, I didn't really like that presentation the other day," right? I'm probably thinking, well, I didn't have enough time because so and so needed something, right? We tend to attribute negative feedback to external forces. We have this little vision of our self image, right, in our brain. And the minute we hear negative feedback, our brain starts to build these walls around it to protect ourselves. And it's very common, it's almost subconscious. Like we're not necessarily really aware that we're doing it, but we will overly attribute negative feedback that we get to external forces and overly attribute positive feedback to our own efforts and abilities. So that's what's happening in the mind of the person that you're giving feedback to. Now, if you are the one providing the feedback, right, that kind of gets flipped a little bit. Those providing feedback tend to attribute and sometimes overly attribute both positive and negative feedback, so success or failure, to the efforts and abilities of the individual alone. So they may not take into account external forces enough, particularly when you're talking about negative feedback. We're going to come back to this and why it matters, but I do really think, again, it's just one of those things it's really important to recognize, to be aware of, so that you can kind of catch yourself maybe when you're getting negative feedback and that wall starts to go up, whoa, I don't need to maybe protect myself quite so much. Or when you're giving feedback, to maybe think a little bit more about external forces that could have impacted the outcome, right? We're going to talk about a specific technique too when you're giving feedback that can kind of help deal with this attribution difference as well. All right, so what does good quality feedback look like? What are the elements that we need to have feedback that is going to be high quality, that's going to be impactful, and ultimately accomplish the goal of changing behavior? Well, we want to make sure that our feedback is specific, right? And this is true for both positive and negative feedback, right? So it's great to hear, "Hey, good job." That's not a bad thing to tell someone, but it doesn't actually help them understand what about that was good, right? If you can point out specific things that someone did well, that's going to help them repeat those in the future. So it's definitely true for positive feedback, and then also very true for negative feedback. Just like a blanket statement of, "I don't like this," or "that didn't go well," it's not quite helpful because it doesn't actually address what can we do better or differently going forward, right? So we want to be specific. We want it to be timely, right? It is an investment, especially if you are a manager and you have so much on your plate and something happens, to dedicate a few minutes to have a discussion with that person about what happened and provide feedback. But it really is an investment in growing your team. And the goal is that the more you do this, that you just build the habit, but also that your employees, right, that they start to stop doing these things, that they start to think differently about how they're performing. So timely feedback given directly after a situation, it's much better than kind of holding it for review time, for a meeting for some point in the future. And then future focus. This is probably, out of all of the things we're going to talk about today, one of the most important. And this is really how we overcome that attribution difference issue we talked about in that slide with the big brain, right? It's much better when you're giving feedback to be focused on next steps and future actions versus having this big diagnosis of what happened to get to, where we were. So people are biased towards seeing past events as inevitable, and they tend to focus on things that are out of their control if you ask them how it could have been better. So if someone said to me, "Hey, Ellen, I didn't love that presentation. What happened?" Right? I'm going to see the events as inevitable. And so my focus will be like, well, if so-and-so didn't give me so much work, I'm going to focus on the stuff that was out of my control. If you think about or ask someone to think about how to improve future performance, people tend to focus more on the things that are under their control. So what that all kind of boils down to is that we want to avoid, when we're giving feedback, this diagnosis of the past, right? You don't actually need to agree on why something happened in order to give feedback and talk about how to make it better going forward. Because of that attribution difference, you may never agree, right? The person that you're giving the feedback to might be sure that it was outside forces, and you might be quite sure that it was them. And if you get into this discussion, you might not get anywhere. And so these are the types of discussions that actually can have a negative impact when you're trying to diagnose, when you're trying to get like alignment on exactly what happened. You don't really need that, right? You can simply point out what happened. You can say, hey, this is what I observed. And then you can ask, how can we do that differently going forward? How can we make sure that doesn't happen again, right? It's going to be much more positive in terms of getting people to actually intend to change their behavior, to keep your feedback future focused. It's been shown through studies that that's a much more positive way to do that, right? And again, that applies certainly in our professional lives. My 7-year-old actually came home from school the other day and got in trouble. He's a rowdy boy. All of his friends are rowdy boys. They're being a little too rowdy. And instead of trying to like agree on what happened, because the minute we do that, it's like, well, I didn't do that, and he said this and that, and it just becomes an endless loop. Instead of that, we said, well, what can you do differently in the future, right? If this happens again or something like this. And suddenly his answers were much more positive. It was much more about what he could do differently. And this same technique works very, very well when we're talking about feedback in our workplaces as well, not just personal lives. I think this approach too, especially if you're talking about peer-to-peer feedback, right, where you maybe don't have that manager-employee relationship, instead of trying to put blame or say, why did this happen or why did you do that? The conversation becomes, hey, I noticed, right, that this happened. How can we change that? Is there a process we need to think about? Is there something? And you'll see people being much more engaged with those discussions than if you try to kind of agree or, again, diagnose what happened in the past. Let's look at a quick example of this, right, from the optical world. So here's an example, right, of unhelpful feedback. I'm in my monthly meeting with my employee and I say, oh, the way you handled that patient frame issue last month, it really hurt us. Honestly, I'm not sure if we can recover the relationship. And I'm the employee, and immediately my walls go up and I think, I can't believe you're just talking about this now. And I didn't do that. And this happened, right? I'm defensive. What's wrong with this feedback? Well, one, it's not very timely because this happened last month. So it's already kind of past when we should have talked about it. It's not specific, right? What about the way that it was handled was an issue? So it's a little bit too general. And then also, it's not future focused, right? All you're going to get if this is your feedback is a bunch of excuses about why it wasn't their fault. And that's just natural. That's what we should expect to happen, right? So how can we change this feedback to be a lot more positive? Hey, I noticed that Mrs. Jones was upset when she left today because her frame wasn't ready yet. I know there was an issue with the lab, so what do you think we could do differently next time from a communication standpoint to avoid this from happening in the future, right? So in contrast, this feedback, it's immediate. So it's earlier today, right? This happened. In my scenario that I've built here, maybe she wasn't communicated to or somehow it got lost in translation that her frame wasn't ready because there was an issue with the lab. And it's specific, right? So there was a communication issue, but it's also future focused. How can we help this from happening in the future? So again, when you're giving feedback, think about these 3 things. Is it timely? Is it specific? And is it future focused? And that's really going to guide you to a much better, no matter who you're giving feedback to, a much better outcome that helps hit that goal, right? Which is changing behavior going forward and getting people to think a little bit differently about how they're performing. All right. So moving from giving feedback to receiving feedback, which arguably can be harder, especially when we're talking about maybe feedback that's not overall positive, right? Getting feedback, especially negative feedback, can definitely be a little bit difficult. I'm speaking for myself at least here than giving it, right? When we get negative feedback, it does challenge our positive self view. Most people want to do a good job, right? Most of the time we go up to work, we show up, we think, I want to perform well. Now, maybe you have some very terrible people out there who show up thinking, I don't want to perform well, right? Hopefully you don't work with any of those. But most people, they want to perform well. And so when we fail, when we don't perform well, it challenges our positive self-image, and our brain starts this overtime working, right, to refute this feedback, to look for causes outside of ourselves. Receiving particularly negative feedback with openness in a way that allows us to grow from it is difficult, but there are some techniques that we can use to really make sure that we're doing the best job that we can at that. So the first one, and again, this is very basic, but so difficult, right? Practice active listening. Stay in the moment mentally and try to avoid interrupting. Again, it is very natural that when we get negative feedback, our brain just starts off immediately on this defense, right? It's like shooting all these things out, even if we're not saying them, we're thinking it. That's not my fault, and that was them, and da, da, da. And what happens is that we're then completely not listening, right? We are having our own discussion in our head about all the ways that this wasn't our fault, and we're missing anything that's being said to us. We're not listening actively. So it's really hard to try to stay in the moment. It's one of those things that takes practice. You probably will have to remind yourself multiple times, right? To stop, to avoid interrupting, and to just stay in the moment. The more you do it, the better you'll get. But just know and recognize that that defensiveness is natural, right? It's nothing on you. It's a normal reaction to getting negative feedback in any way, right? Professionally, personally. But we really need to kind of try to push back against that reaction, stay in that moment, and really actively listening to make sure that we're understanding, we're getting the full impact of that feedback. Make sure you pause, before responding. I also think it's okay if you need time to kind of digest it. So when I get feedback, sometimes I'll work on trainings, I'll work on presentations or different things for a long time. So they're kind of like my babies, right? I really care about them and I spend a lot of time and effort on them. So when someone gives me feedback that maybe is saying, oh, we don't like that as much, or we want you to change this, it's hard, right? I have an emotional connection to whatever it is. So sometimes I find it's easier to get the feedback, take a beat, and then the next day have the meeting where we talk about it and we talk about what we're going to change. And I usually find for me that gives me enough time to kind of disconnect emotionally and really see the feedback for what it is. And in pretty much every single case, the end product is better for it, as long as the feedback is high quality and it's coming from a good place. Then it always makes it better. But I need some time to digest. So I think, if you're a manager giving feedback, learn your employees' technique. You can ask them, hey, when I give you some feedback, or if I have things that I want to work on, do you want me to send you that ahead of time so you can think about it? Or even if you're still in that moment in that meeting, just take a beat. You don't have to immediately respond. If you immediately respond, they'll probably start to come up with all those excuses, right? It's okay to say, do you mind if I just take a minute? I want to kind of think about this before I respond. And if you're that manager or you're that person giving the feedback, you should respect that and say, yeah, of course, take a beat, it's all right. Work to control your physical reaction. Again, when we hear negative feedback, our default is to get defensive. And sometimes that also shows up in our body language, right? So we might cross our arms, we might kind of shrink into ourselves or physically try to turn away. Our face, I have a face that can be very emotive, to my detriment sometimes. So recognize that can happen. If you note yourself trying to do that, just try to relax, because sometimes when our body does that, it can actually send a signal to our brain, right, that we are defensive. So we want to try to go for more of a don't get mad, get curious mindset. Get curious about, well, where is this feedback coming from? Is it quality feedback? Do I believe that it's valid? Why do you feel this way? That kind of thing. It can be really helpful. So try to control that immediate reaction, even in terms of your body language. And then certainly ask clarifying questions. We just because I say, pause before responding or avoid interrupting, it doesn't mean you say nothing. You want to make sure that you understand. Even if it's positive feedback, sometimes people will give more generic positive feedback. Great job. Oh, thanks so much. Was there anything you specifically, liked about it that I should continue for the future? So even if it's positive feedback, you can ask some questions to make sure that you fully understand kind of where it's coming from and what it means. And then, even if the feedback was tough to hear, thank them for it. If they took the time to give you the feedback, right, in a way, again, that was respectful and, hopefully future focused and all those things we talked about before, thank them for it. And then try to take that time for reflection and for self assessment. When we really consider people's feedback, it can definitely help us grow. We have blind spots in ourselves, right, in the way that we work and the way that we handle things. So having someone who's being honest and vulnerable enough with us to really tell us what they think is a really hard thing for somebody else to do. So we should respect it. And if you can kind of take the time to think about it, to disconnect that emotional reaction, it's absolutely a big opportunity for growth for all of us, no matter how good we are, no matter how long we've been doing what we're doing. I'm a trainer, so I always think everybody can grow and get better. My least favorite thing is when someone tells me, like, I don't need training on that. I've done this forever. I'm like, okay, well, so you're the best in the whole world, right? No, we can all get better. We can all improve. So this is something to keep in mind, even when you're hearing feedback that maybe is tough or is not 100% positive, think of it as a growth opportunity. Can kind of change your perception of it. We're on a Zoom call and you guys are muted. I want to ask you to kind of unmute to do this right now. But think of a time that you received tough feedback. What helped you handle it productively? Was there something about the way that you processed it? Was it something about the way that the feedback was given? This is a great topic. Even if you have a staff meeting, you have a call with your people, you're talking about feedback. This can be a nice kind of prompt for that. And we probably all have times when we've gotten feedback that was tough, that ended up actually really, really helping us and contributing to our overall success. And so think about what happened when you got that feedback, what allowed you to kind of work through it and to use it to grow and to develop. And then try to integrate that into both how you receive feedback, but also how you give feedback as well. All right. So building on to our final kind of topic here as part of our feedback presentation is, how do you build a feedback culture? So it's wonderful, of course, on an individual level to know how to give really good feedback, and hopefully you do now, how to respond or receive feedback with openness in a way that allows you to grow. But in order for any of that feedback to kind of be happening, we really need a feedback culture in our organization. So we're going to talk about 3 techniques, 3 things that we can do within our organizations. And now you may not be able or responsible for all of these, which is, it happens, but these are just things to think about, particularly if you are in any kind of a management role, or you have, people, you're working in a part of the practice or a part of the organization where you can impact this. So fostering trust. This is really, really important. If you don't have an environment where people feel trust, they feel that they can be honest and open, it's going to be really hard to get quality feedback at most levels of the organization. Leading by example. So making sure that you're modeling feedback, that you're asking for feedback. We'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And then finally, making it continuous. So again, if you are in an organization where like feedback happens once a year and it's annual reviews, that's really not enough feedback, right? That's what puts us in this dangerous spot of people leaving, people not feeling like they know how they're doing, not feeling connected. So you want to make sure that feedback's continuous. Let's look at each of these a little bit deeper, right? So fostering trust. Psychological safety in the workplace refers to an environment where people feel comfortable. They feel comfortable expressing their opinions, they feel comfortable taking risks, and they also feel comfortable admitting mistakes, right, without a fear of negative consequences. So, creating a sense of psychological safety is really paramount if you want people to feel that they can give honest feedback, right? That they can talk about what's going on and that they can have these discussions that acknowledge, hey, something didn't go great, but we can make it better in the future, right? But there has to be a sense of trust in order for that to happen. So, how can we do this? Well, we can set the tone, right? If you're a leader in the organization or even a leader, honestly, in your part of the practice, right? Leadership can be structural, but if you might be just have someone that's been there a long time, you might be kind of a leader of your group, even if you don't have management technically over other people within your role. That's absolutely a leadership position as well that really matters in organizations. So set the tone, right? Demonstrate vulnerability, share your own mistakes, and encourage open communication. And also, we want to make sure that when mistakes happen, because we're all human and we're all going to make them, right? That it's not punitive, right? That we acknowledge them and then we figure out how can this be a learning opportunity, right? That is going to make people trustworthy. Now, obviously, if you have someone that's continually making really big mistakes, yes, there is a limit to that. But we want people to think I can mess up and it's not the end of the world, right? Because we're all going to work together to figure out how to make it better, how to fix it for the future. So setting that tone as a leader is really important. Establishing clear expectations around things like communication, around respectful behavior, feedback and conflict resolution, all these kinds of things, right? Kind of basic stuff, but really, really does matter. Encouraging diverse perspectives, so sourcing information, sourcing opinions from different people of different backgrounds who have different specialties, right? It's going to help show that you really value people's input, that you're not just constantly going to, a few people, that you're really getting first perspective on different things. Promoting active listening. Active listening, I know we talked about briefly, could be easily an hour training in and of itself. It's so simple in theory, but it's so hard to do well. So really talking about active listening, right? That's a great training opportunity in and of itself. But making sure that people understand what does it mean to active listening, and then if you're a leader, kind of modeling that as well. And then certainly encouraging collaboration, teamwork, shared responsibility, all these things. So none of these things directly relate maybe to feedback, but when we do them, we are creating an environment where people feel safe enough, where they have that sense of psychological safety to be honest and to give feedback at all levels of the organization. This is my example, right? So it's hard to ask people to be giving honest feedback if you are not willing to also get it yourself, right? Especially when you're in a manager role in the organization. So I think if you are looking for that kind of, we'll say like up the chain feedback, sometimes you do have to ask for it. It's amazing if you have the type of relationship with your people underneath you, with your employees, where they can come and they can give you feedback unprompted. Once you've gotten to that point, you kind of know that you are in a really great place. You've created psychological safety. But to get there, we might need to ask for it, right? People might not feel comfortable always just going to their manager and giving feedback. So asking for it, showing that you are looking for feedback can be really important. It can be informal. You can, just generally let people know that you take feedback. You can also consider things like surveys, right? Sometimes people feel more comfortable being anonymous. It can be awkward. We talked about that emotional barrier, right? An anonymous survey can help kind of overcome that. So people feel maybe that they can be a little more honest and open than they would otherwise. One thing that I like, especially if we're talking about feedback that we're sourcing kind of at the manager level, is using some kind of a model. Because if you just ask generically and say, send me feedback, right? It can be all over the map. You can get a lot of different things. It can be hard to kind of organize it, and it might not be actionable feedback. So if you are doing that, this is a model that I really like. It's called the start, stop, continue model. I like it because it's very simple, it's very action oriented, and it kind of organizes your feedback that you're getting into these buckets that are a bit easier to kind of take action on, to figure out what to do with all this information. So what this model asks is basically three things, right? What actions or behaviors should we start doing, either you as an individual or the organization as a whole, to help all of us and the organization achieve its goals? What actions or behaviors are negatively impacting performance that we should stop? And then what actions or behaviors are working well to impact performance that we should continue? So what should we start, what should we stop, and what should we continue? And it allows you to kind of get feedback, but in a way that's a little bit more structured. And then if you get this feedback, then give more feedback. Start to get in this like weird feedback loop. But when you ask people for feedback, there's nothing more frustrating as an employee than having this big survey go out and taking all this time, right? You're going to give feedback and then it's crickets. Nothing happens. We don't have any information about the feedback. What are we doing? Nothing ever changes. That can be really disheartening. So if you're asking for feedback, I would encourage you, once you get it, to kind of report back on it. Thank you so much for the feedback. These are the things that we love that we're going to try to implement right away. Here's the things we think are great ideas, but maybe they have to wait for whatever reason. And then here's the feedback that maybe it's not going to work, and this is why. So it's just acknowledging that you got it, even if it's not something you can do right away or at all. You're still saying, we hear you, and this is why maybe we can or cannot do that right this moment. So I think a model, when you're asking for feedback, can be really, really, really helpful. And then finally, how do we create a culture of feedback? We want to make feedback continuous, right? We want to build feedback into our everyday workflows. So that might look like scheduling regular sessions, right? Even if it's a quick 15-minute check-in, that doesn't have to take a really long time, right? Even if you just make it your kind of goal to, if you see even once a week per employee, to stop and give feedback on a specific thing that you witness, right? It can take 5 minutes. It doesn't have to take 2 hours, especially if we're not diagnosing the past and we're not trying to come to an agreement. So whether you kind of schedule it or you just make it a goal, that's really important. You also want to make sure you're teaching feedback models. So obviously, if I'm on this call, we're talking about all these things you can do, but you want to make sure that that message goes down to everybody so that everyone understands, when I give feedback, these are the things that it should be, right? It should be specific, it should be timely, it should be future focused. And that doesn't really matter if I'm giving feedback to an employee, if I'm giving peer-to-peer feedback, or feedback kind of up to my manager. We want to make sure everyone understands those models so that you have good feedback, you have quality feedback throughout the organization. Make sure that you're encouraging, you're empowering peer-to-peer and employee to manager feedback as well. Again, so we don't just want it to be a one-way street. We want it to be a branches all, roads going all over the place, back and forth, but in a way that's respectful, in a way that is beneficial. We don't want to just start telling people to give feedback without teaching them anything about it, and then suddenly it's chaos because, well, they told me I'm not doing a good job, right? That's not what we're going for. So we want to encourage it, but we also want to empower it to be good as well. And then definitely provide feedback on positive moments also, right? And try to make it specific. So it's easy to assume that people know they're doing a good job, but as we saw in that first slide, or one of those first slides, most people don't. Most people feel like they have no idea how they're doing. So if you witness something good and you want to continue that behavior, call that out. I would avoid calling out negative behavior or giving negative feedback in a large group setting, not the best. But if you are giving positive feedback that's specific, yeah, that's great because you're rewarding that person, but you're also kind of showing everybody else, this is what we want you to do, right? This is what I saw, this is what I witnessed, this is what was great about it, good job. And everybody else understands, oh, that's a type of behavior that maybe I want to integrate as well. So calling out the positive feedback in a specific way. Very, very important also. All right, so we are almost at the end of my speech here, but just a couple key takeaways, things that to remember as we close out the session here. So feedback really does drive, excuse me, growth, right? When we think about how do we grow our employees, there's obviously lots of ways, but one of the key ways that we can do that is by giving them feedback on what is working, on what is not. I can think back on my career and pick out like specific moments of really high impact feedback that I got that I still reference today, right? So this is a huge way that you can grow your employees. You can continue to develop them, or you can grow yourself, right? You can learn how to really take feedback and internalize it. You can ask for feedback, get specific with it, right? So whether you're helping to grow somebody else or you're growing yourself, feedback is really, really important for both of those things. It should be a two-way exchange. It is not a one-way street, right? So when we're building a feedback culture, we're thinking from an organizational perspective, how do we do that? It means both giving and getting feedback consistently. If we are only ever giving feedback and we're never creating a situation where we can get it, that's kind of a one-way street, right? And it's likely that your employees or people in the organization do notice that. So you want to create those opportunities for feedback to go both ways. And then just like anything else, right? Practice builds comfort. I like this a lot better than practice makes perfect because I fundamentally disagree with that statement. The more that you practice both giving high quality feedback and getting high quality feedback, and taking that feedback and really doing something with it, if you're getting it, right, the more comfortable you're going to be. So if you are uncomfortable, you can practice, right? Sit with someone. If you're like, I'm not good at giving feedback, I kind of freeze, and you are looking to even build into a management role, practice with somebody else, do some more research on it. There's so many different models out there. There's a lot of literature. I think in the chat, someone referenced a book maybe that I saw. So there's tons of different things that you can do, but you have to practice it. It's not natural. It doesn't just naturally happen, but it's absolutely something that you can get better at, both the giving of feedback and also the receiving of feedback as well. And then one last thing before we pause for questions or we pass it over to questions is, what is one thing that you'll do differently from feedback perspective starting today, right? We talked about a lot on this presentation. Well, I talked about a lot on this presentation, but you're all going to go back to your jobs and you're going to have a million things to do. And even if you really liked what you heard, it's very hard to kind of change everything at once. So I'd love for you, maybe jot it down once the session ends, right? What's one thing I'll do differently with feedback starting today? Maybe it's something about giving it, making it future focused. Maybe it's really trying to be more open when you're getting feedback or promoting feedback in the organization, whatever it is. I'd love if you could pick one thing and write it down. And then when you get to work the next time, or if you're already there, when you go back to work, think about, right, how can I actually integrate this into the way that I do my job? That would be amazing from a trainer's perspective. So that's all that I have on the my formal presentation here. So I didn't know if there was any questions, if anybody wanted to put a question in the chat or unmute themselves and ask a question, please feel free. I'm happy to take them, or I can give my email also if someone has a question that they'd rather ask separately too, that's fine.
It looks like a couple questions are coming in. That was wonderful, Ellen. Thank you so much. You just deliver amazing content, and everything about this is so valuable. Someone is asking about the recording. So we do have the recording that we will email out to our Lunchtime Learning attendees, and it will also be published on the website.
Okay. Yeah, so someone just put a comment, and I'll encourage feedback from those employees that don't say too much or nothing at all. So someone like that who is really reticent, right? Who, even if you're saying like, I want feedback, that's maybe when a feedback mechanism that is like a survey or something that doesn't involve them talking up, even if it's one-on-one. They might just feel, people have different degrees of comfort with that. So encouraging them certainly is great, or bringing it to a one-on-one place, but also you might find that you get more feedback from them using, kind of a method where they don't have to speak up right away. Honestly, even something like SurveyMonkey, there's a lot of different programs. Even if you're having a meeting and you want to get people's like opinions on things, or you want feedback live, you can have people enter in their phone. Nobody can see who's saying what. So that could be another technique to think about too, for people who are a little bit shy in terms of, actually speaking up. But I love that. I think they probably have a lot of good stuff to share, and just they might just be a little shy, or a little reticent. So
Yeah, we've actually done that for using Google Forms as well as
oh,
SurveyMonkey,
great.
actually, for especially when we're preparing for like all staff meetings or anything like that. It's a great way for them to be able to give feedback anonymously,
Yeah.
especially for those who normally don't speak up, or troublemakers that speak up within their peers but don't speak up to management. We all know, but it definitely creates that platform where we are able to get the feedback, but our accountability definitely is that we do publicly share that feedback with the team, so that they see, yeah, we are getting this feedback. Is there an agreement? Is it just a one-off? And
Yeah.
then being able to have those discussions, like when we do have the all staff meeting, makes a difference, because then it kind of opens up the room for them to feel more confident in sharing the why.
Yep. Yeah. No, I love that. I think having that transparency is really nice, so that, and to your point, like sometimes there's people that overshare maybe, or take over a little bit. So kind of having them pre-enter it can keep everything flowing, but it's also a way to hold, management accountable, and everybody can see it. So I think it's a great technique to use. Somebody had a question in the chat. If someone is receiving feedback and isn't open to it, how can you pivot that into a more open behavior? So I think if I was giving feedback and I could just tell, this is not going well, they are not agreeing with me, that's where that future focus can be really helpful. Because a lot of the times when someone's very closed off, it's because in their mind, they fundamentally disagree with you about this, basically the situation, right? So you're saying, hey, this happened and we need to work on it. And in their mind, they're saying, I didn't do that. That wasn't my fault, right? And it's all those things, those defenses are going up. One thing that's important to remember is that in order for someone to be open to feedback or be open to changing their behavior, they do have to think that the feedback is valid. So what happens when the risk you run of getting into that diagnosis of the past, where you're, it's a blame game and you're kind of going back and forth, is that they do not see then your feedback is valid, because they think you don't know what happened, you don't understand, right? And so I'm not even going to listen to what you say. So I would say avoiding that, trying to avoid that altogether, can be really helpful. So from the beginning, right, not getting into that, just focusing on how do we change in the future, right? We don't have to agree on why this happened. We're not going to get into it. The other thing I would say is think about if they seem still, if you're trying to do that and they're still really like closed off, what else is happening, right? Like what might be making them closed off? Because maybe they don't have trust in the organization. Maybe they feel like there's something going on and they just don't trust what you're saying. So is there some kind of interpersonal thing happening? Maybe there's somebody else who could give them the feedback, again, depending on who it is. But I do think that future focus can be really, really helpful, and just avoiding any kind of why did this happen or how did this happen, it's just not, it's okay to think and look back on the processes and try to change them, to be better in the future, but going into the why of a specific situation generally is unhelpful. So I hope that, I don't know if that answers the question. I hope it's helpful feedback on my part. Anybody else? Questions or just comments or things that you're doing that are working? Or
While we're waiting for the next comment or question, I do want to add that if everybody will keep an eye on their email, because we want to hear their feedback on our program today. So please be sure to find that email and answer the survey so we can continue to bring you valuable topics like we did today.
Yeah. And I will receive your feedback with open.
Yes.
I'll practice what I preach. I don't know if there's any more questions right now.
Anything else? Any more comments, questions? You can certainly feel free to follow up after if something comes up that you want to ask Ellen about. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. We would absolutely love to help make that connection.
Great.
Wonderful. All right. Well, Ellen, thank you again for your amazing support and your wonderful content. We certainly appreciate you being with us today and bringing this valuable content to our membership.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. It was so nice seeing all of you again. And I look forward to, hopefully getting to do this again in the future.
Yes.